The Arab Spring was a wave of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa from late 2010 to 2012. The origins of the Arab Spring can be traced back to a series of protests that began in Tunisia in December 2010. These protests were sparked by the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor who set himself on fire in protest of police harassment and economic hardship. Bouazizi's acts of desperation struck a chord with many Tunisians who were also struggling to make ends meet under the authoritarian regime of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. The protests in Tunisia quickly gained momentum on January 14, 2010. Ben Ali fled the country, ending his 23-year reign. The success of the Tunisian revolution inspired similar uprisings in other Arab countries, including Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. These uprisings were fueled by a combination of political, economic, and social grievances, including corruption, high unemployment, and lack of political freedoms. In Egypt, protests erupted in the Tahrir Square in Cairo on January 25, 2011. The protests were initially led by youth activists who were frustrated with the corruption and authoritarianism of President Hosni Mubarak. The protests quickly grew in size, and on February 11, 2011, Mubarak was forced to resign after 30 years in power.
How determined are you, sir, to stop these movements, to prevent their existence?
Yes, we are arresting them. We are not arresting politicians at all. It's only for this crime. Those who belongs to the Takfir and Hijrah, and those who had any slight participation in this last event. We are going to be very firm with them, and we are not going to let anybody escape from punishment.
In Libya, protests began in February 2011 following the arrest of human rights lawyer Fatih Derbil. The protests quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war, with opposition forces backed by NATO airstrikes, eventually overthrowing longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi in October 2011. In Yemen, protests began in January 2011, led by youth activists who were demanding political reform and an end to the 33-year rule of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. The protests were met with violence from security forces, and the country eventually descended into civil war with multiple factions vying for control of the country. In Syria, protests began in March 2011, led by activists who were inspired by the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. The protests were met with a brutal crackdown by President Bashar al-Assad's regime, and the country eventually descended into a full-blown civil war, which is still ongoing. The Arab Spring was a historic moment in the Middle East and North Africa, with millions of people taking to the streets to demand greater political freedoms and economic opportunities. However, the aftermath of the Arab Spring has been mixed, with some countries making significant progress towards democracy, while others have descended into chaos and violence. In Tunisia, the birthplace of Arab Spring, the country has made significant strides towards democracy. Since the ouster of Ben Ali, Tunisia has held free and fair elections, established a new constitution, and made progress towards addressing some of the economic and social grievances that sparked the revolution. While Tunisia still faces significant challenges, including high unemployment and economic inequality, the country's transition into democracy is seen as a rare success story in the region. In Egypt, the aftermath of Arab Spring has been more complicated. After the fall of Mubarak, the country held democratic elections, which were won by the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohamed Morsi. However, Morsi's tenure was short-lived as he was ousted in a military coup in 2013. Since then, Egypt has been ruled by former military general Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who has cracked down on political dissent and restricted civil liberties. While Egypt has remained relatively stable, the country's authoritarian turn has raised concerns among human rights advocates. In Libya and Yemen, the aftermath of the Arab Spring has been marked by instability and conflict. Both countries descended into conflict as a result. The Arab Spring uprisings marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Middle East and North Africa region. While the uprisings were initially seen as a beacon of hope for political and economic reform, they ultimately resulted in a prolonged and complex conflict that has had profound social, economic, and political consequences. The conflict has left a trail of destruction and has caused significant suffering for millions of people in the region. The road to recovery and stability will be a long and challenging one, requiring a concerted effort from all stakeholders. Only through cooperation and commitment to dialogue and reconciliation can the region move forward towards a more peaceful and prosperous future.